Hello students and welcome back to Biology 100. Today's lecture is on the digestive system and nutrition. Okay, the whole point of the digestive system is to take food into the body, to break that food up into smaller pieces and assimilate the nutrients so that we can repair our own cells and also have energy to do our various cellular processes. So this process is divided into 5 sub-processes, including mechanical processing. A lot of what we do is mastication, chewing, breaking things into smaller pieces. We do a lot of secretion in the GI tract as well. We secrete things like acids and enzymes to help break things down. We also secrete mucus to keep moving things along. And finally, digestion here is the catabolic process where we're breaking down large molecules into smaller molecules so that those molecules could be absorbed across the intestinal epithelia. And absorption here is primarily what's going on in the small intestine. We're absorbing those monomers of the macromolecules through our intestinal epithelia into the bloodstream, into the lymphatic fluid so that those nutrients can be assimilated and distributed throughout the body. And finally, we use the large intestine or colon to eliminate undigestible waste products. All right, there's 2 different divisions of the digestive system. We have first the GI organs that are gastrointestinal. These are all a hollow tube starting from the mouth, going through the pharynx, the esophagus, eventually leading to the rectum and anus. So everything you swallow is moving through this hollow tube. And then we have the accessory digestive organs. These are not part of the hollow tube. Instead, they secrete things that go into the tube, in the case of the pancreas, or they help to assimilate nutrients that were absorbed from the tube, in the case of the liver. All right, let's start out with our gastrointestinal tract. This tract consists of several layers, the most inside layer of which is the mucosal layer. So the mucosal layer is the layer that is lining the lumen or hollow part of the cavity. So this would be a hollow part of the intestine, and this is the area through which food is moving. So that food first encounters something called our mucosal epithelium. It's usually going to be a simple epithelium in the case of the intestines and also the stomach, but it can be stratified in areas such as the esophagus. Also under there, we have something called the lamina propria, which is a connective tissue area where we have a lot of areolar connective tissue, and then something called the muscularis mucosae, which gives a little bit of 3-dimensional framework to our mucosal layer. So the functions of the mucosal layer are 1, secretion. We're secreting enzymes. We're secreting things like mucus and acids. 2 is absorption. Number 1 here for absorption is in the small intestine. We have a simple epithelium, and we just wick that stuff across and put it eventually in the bloodstream. The other thing is to reduce friction. Because the mucosal layer is producing lots and lots of mucus, that mucus helps to reduce friction and helps to move the food along the alimentary canal. And finally, this mucosal layer helps to protect underlying layers from digestion because we have a lot of caustic enzymes in here that are breaking down food molecules but could also break down our tissues. For that reason, we're replacing our mucosal epithelium every 5 to 7 days. That's tremendous. Okay, our next layer here is the submucosa layer. The submucosa is composed of moderately dense areolar connective tissue, and it contains lots of blood and lymphatic tissue. And these vessels are helping to transport nutrients that are absorbed across that mucosal epithelium to elsewhere in the body. So we also have lots of nervous tissue in the submucosal layer, and that nervous tissue is helping to control the glands and also the smooth muscle that's in the GI tract. So major functions of the submucosa is, again, transport with the blood vessels and also the lymphatic vessels, and also controlling the processes of digestion. Okay, the next layer outside of the submucosal layer is something called the muscularis layer. And as the name implies, this contains lots and lots of muscular tissue. Now, for the most part, it's going to be smooth muscle and involuntary, and there will be circular smooth muscle and longitudinal smooth muscle that helps to move things through the GI tract through the process of peristalsis. Now, in some places, we can have skeletal muscle, for example, in the upper part of the pharynx, and also in the lower part of the rectum. We'll have an external anal sphincter there that will be able to control the movement of things out of the bowels. So major functions of the muscularis is regulate GI movement. It determines how quickly things move from one loop of the intestine to the next. It also helps with churning and mixing, and this is especially true for the stomach, where we have this periodic mixing, just like a high-efficiency washing machine. So the question I pose to you, at what point is the muscularis under voluntary control? Well, there's 2 points. Up here in the pharynx and first part of the esophagus, that's voluntary, right? You can determine whether or not you want to swallow the food, but after that food's swallowed, it's pretty much involuntary until the next action is going to be defecation. We have an external anal sphincter that can allow us to voluntarily defecate or decide to defecate at a later time. Okay, the next layer outside the muscularis layer is called the serosa layer. The serosa layer is composed mainly of connective tissues, and the major function here is to surround and protect the other three layers and also attach them to the body wall. So here you can see it's attaching us to the body wall, and here all are blood vessels that are leaving the submucosal layer and attaching to the body wall. So if you see those slasher movies where somebody gets ripped open like by a velociraptor or something like that, and their intestines just go bleh on the floor, that's not completely realistic, because in reality the serosa would be holding all that material, all those organs, into the body cavity. Okay, here are digestive processes again. Just a reminder: mechanical processing, mastication, chewing. We're going to have secretion of enzymes, of acids. We're going to have breaking down of chemical components into smaller components. And then we're going to have absorption in our small intestine and eventually elimination in our large intestine. Okay, so let's go to the first part of the GI tract, and that's the mouth. This is where processing of food first begins, right? Think about your favorite food. As you start to bring it in your body, what are you going to do? Well, first you're going to chew, and chewing is the process of mastication. I know it sounds like a dirty word, but it really isn't. So mastication is just chewing, and by chewing, we're breaking down the food into many smaller pieces, and those smaller pieces have a lot of surface area that our enzymes can act upon. So let's take a look at our teeth. Okay, if you take a look at the adult dentition, you can see we have heterodont dentition, meaning we have different types of teeth. We have incisors and bicuspids for sort of grasping food and shearing it, and then we have molars and premolars, which are flatter for crushing and grinding food. This type of dentition or tooth layout is evolved for organisms like humans, which eat both plant and animal matter. Okay, in addition to having teeth in the mouth, we also have salivary glands, and salivary glands produce a couple important secretions that help with the processing of food. Okay, these secretions include salivary amylase up here and also mucin. First of all, let's start with mucin. Mucin is a protein that becomes hydrated into mucus, and that helps to do a couple things. It helps to bind the ground up food into a bolus or kind of glop that can be swallowed more easily. The other thing that it does is it helps to lubricate it as it moves down the GI tract and the esophagus. Secondly, here we have salivary amylase. Now, anytime you see ASE, you know that it's an enzyme. Many enzymes end in ASE. So salivary amylase breaks down amylose, which is a type of starch. So we begin starch processing and starch digestion in the mouth. So if you're eating a potato or something like that, you actually begin to break down that polysaccharide into monosaccharides using your salivary amylase. Okay, next process we have here, or next structure, is going to be the tongue. We said before that the tongue is used for tasting the food, and that's certainly true, but it's also used for positioning the food and helping to swallow the food. So as you're eating and chewing, your tongue is basically packing that food in the back of the pharynx so it can be more easily swallowed. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the process of swallowing. So what we have here is this nice gloppy food bolus here that's been packed together using our tongue, and the tongue's packing in the back of the pharynx. And remember, it's holding together via all that mucin that we produced in our mouth. It then gets forced to the back of the pharynx. Now take a look at what's going on here. We haven't swallowed it yet, so what's our epiglottis doing? Well, the epiglottis is currently up, which is allowing air to move down through the larynx, down into the trachea. However, when we begin to swallow, the position of the epiglottis will actually change. So here's what's happening when we're swallowing. So now you can see that bolus of food moving further back in the pharynx, and what's happening now is our epiglottis has closed off the opening to the trachea or the larynx, and therefore we can't breathe during this period, but it's helping to keep food going down the back tube, which is the esophagus, and it prevents food from moving down the front tube, which is the trachea. So if for some reason you're swallowing food and it gets stuck at this point, you can actually suffocate because your epiglottis is closed and you're no longer able to breathe. Okay, once you've swallowed that food, what happens next? Well, now we go through the process of peristalsis. Peristalsis is involuntary smooth muscle contraction. So what we can see here is we have this bolus of food up here, and we have smooth muscle contraction behind the food and relaxation in front of it. And so that basically results in a directional movement until we get that food into the stomach. Now, the stomach is a GI organ that almost everybody is familiar with, right? You think about when your stomach is full or your stomach is empty, and most of us are aware that the stomach functions in food storage. So we can eat a lot of food, think buffet time here, and we'll store that food in the stomach, principally in an area called the fundus. So the fundus is this round region right here, which helps to store food until it can be processed. The other thing the stomach does is it helps with protein digestion. So we have a couple different secretions here that aid in protein digestion. The first is hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid doesn't actually break down the proteins, but it does denature them and change their shape so that our enzymes can work more efficiently on it. So pepsin is the principal enzyme we secrete in the stomach, and pepsin helps to break down large proteins into amino acids so they can eventually be absorbed in the small intestine. And of course, we also have lots of mucus being secreted here and elsewhere, and this is especially important in the stomach when the pH is around 2 or 3, and that's very acidic and could easily destroy our stomach and stomach lining if we didn't have a nice protective layer of alkaline mucus. So, in addition to these secretions, what else is the stomach doing? Well, it's doing lots of mixing. If you sit there and watch the stomach or listen to your stomach, every few seconds it'll go womp womp, womp womp. And it's sort of like those high efficiency washing machines that it's sitting there mixing the chyme, the food that you've eaten, with the enzymes and the acids in the stomach so we have more efficient mixing and more efficient digestion of the proteins. The last thing the stomach does is regulate delivery of this chyme, this mixture of enzymes and food, to the small intestine. So this is the first loop of the small intestine here called the duodenum, and right there in the junction we have something called the pyloric sphincter. And the pyloric sphincter is kind of like the orifice on a hot sauce bottle, right? Really tiny, and no matter how hard you shake it, it's going to go weak, and a little bit's going to come past each time. So every time the stomach contracts and does that womp womp, just a little bit of food is going to go bleep past that pylorus and then enter the first loop of the small intestine, which is the duodenum. Okay, here we can see a closer up view of the stomach. Just want to review some anatomy here. So we have our esophagus up here, and then we have a sphincter here called the cardiac sphincter, and another sphincter down at the bottom called the pyloric sphincter. So a sphincter is a ring of smooth muscle usually that helps to regulate movement of things in a hollow organ. So in this case, when we swallow food and it moves down the esophagus by peristalsis, our cardiac sphincter will open up, allow that food in, and then it will shut back up again. And that's important because what do we have in the stomach? Well, we have lots of acid. And if we didn't have that sphincter there, some of that acid could leak up into the esophagus and cause erosion there. And that does happen to some people that have heartburn and things like that. Same here with the duodenum. The duodenum is another sphincter that only allows a little bit of food or chyme past that duodenal sphincter at any one time. And that's important because the small intestine can only really process a little bit of food at one time. So here's a question that many people ask. Does the stomach actually absorb many nutrients? And the answer is not really. The stomach really isn't set up much for absorption. First of all, the only things we've really started to digest was the starch in the mouth using our amylase and the proteins in the stomach using pepsin. However, this stomach has this really thick alkaline mucus lining that kind of prevents a lot of things from being absorbed. So the main function here is digestion and storage of food. We don't really start absorbing nutrients until we get to the small intestine. There are some exceptions. Some small nonpolar molecules like alcohol can move across the stomach to some degree. But for the most part, most of the absorption and assimilation is going to happen in the small intestine. Okay, let's take a look at the small intestine. Now, even though we call it the small intestine, that's kind of a misnomer. We name it for the width or diameter of the tube, which is about 1 inch or about one segment on your finger right there. However, it's around 10 to 12 feet long, so it's one of the longest organs in the body. And the functions here are various. First of all, we're still doing lots of digestion. We have something in there called brush border enzymes, which continue digestion of carbohydrates. In addition, we also have enzymes provided by our pancreas, which are going to help digest lipids. The other thing that the small intestine does, along with the pancreas, is help to neutralize stomach acid. That's principally the pancreas's function, but the small intestine is where that occurs. And finally, we have a lot of absorption. The small intestine is your #1 absorptive organ. This is where we're absorbing the monosaccharides and carbohydrates. This is where we're absorbing the amino acids from our proteins and the fatty acids and monoglycerides from the fats that we eat. So you might be asking yourself, why on earth is the small intestine so darn long? The answer is it helps to facilitate a large surface area for absorption. So the more surface area we have, the better we're going to be at absorption. And there's other factors that also increase the absorptive surface in addition to the length. For one, we have these three-dimensional folds on the intestine that also help to increase surface area. Now, surface area is good not only for absorption, but also for secretion. Remember, we have lots of membrane-bound enzymes in this membrane that are helping to break down our food. If we take a closer look at that membrane, we see that there's little finger-like projections in the mucosal epithelium called intestinal villi. And villi are little finger-like structures that, again, help to increase the surface area. What is surface area good for? It's good for secretion. It's good for enhanced absorption as well. Now, what you can see inside these intestinal villi is we have capillaries that are part of our circulatory system. These are the vessels through which we're going to be absorbing things like monosaccharides or carbohydrates. They're also going to help us to absorb our amino acids. But in the middle here, we have a second type of vessel called lacteals. Now, lacteals are modified lymphatic vessels, and their job is to absorb the monoglycerides and fatty acids from the fats that we eat. All right, in addition to the folding and the villi, we have a third structure here in the intestine that helps us to greatly enhance the absorptive surface area, and that's something called microvilli. If we look on the individual cells that make up that intestinal villus or finger-like projection, and we look at their apical or top surfaces, we see that they have these little microvilli or small, tiny little finger-like projections. I call these the Bart Simpson haircut, right? If you've seen The Simpsons and know what Bart Simpson looks like. And this has a lot more surface area than if the cell was flat. And again, this helps to enhance our surface area, not only for secretion, but for absorption. Okay, I said before that in addition to doing absorption, the intestine is also very good at digestion. It has certain brush border enzymes. These are enzymes that are actually embedded in those little microvilli, which are called our brush border. And they're enzymes like deoxyribonuclease and ribonuclease. These are enzymes that help to break down the DNA in the food that you eat. Yes, your food has DNA, right? You're eating things that were living at one time, so they had DNA. We also have these other enzymes embedded in the brush border that help to break down disaccharides. One you might recognize here is something called lactase. Remember, ASE usually indicates that it's an enzyme, so lactase helps us to break down the milk sugar, lactose. But I should point out that our ability to produce lactase varies by ethnicity. It also varies by age. As mammals, we really weren't designed to eat milk or dairy products our whole life. And so usually the amount of lactase goes down over time. That results in lactose intolerance. However, there are some groups that have evolved to process lactose throughout their lives, but keep in mind the majority of the world can't digest lactose too well as adults. Okay, we're going to take a break from the GI tract real quick to talk about some of our accessory organs because they're on the way here. First of these, we have the pancreas, and the pancreas is a very important exocrine as well as endocrine organ. For the endocrine system, we said that it helped to produce the hormones insulin and glucagon, which regulated blood sugar. But it also has an exocrine function for the digestive tract. It makes the enzymes pancreatic amylase and pancreatic lipase, and the pancreatic amylase is designed to break down starches again, and the pancreatic lipase is designed to break down fats. So this is the first part where we actually have a fat digesting enzyme. Now you might be asking yourself, well, what about the amylase? We already had amylase in the mouth. Why do we need one in the pancreas? Well, think about the pH or acidity in the mouth. It's usually pretty neutral, around 6 or so, but as you swallow that enzyme and the food, it goes to your stomach, which has a pH of around 2 or 3. Now that shift in pH will denature or basically break down that enzyme and it won't work anymore. So we have to provide another enzyme that will work better at the pH that we're in, either in the stomach or in the intestine. So the intestine is actually fairly neutral, and we'll talk about why in just a second, but we've already lost the enzymes that were produced in our mouth, so we have to make new ones, and we make those here in our pancreas. So the third secretion of the pancreas that's very important that I alluded to before was something called sodium bicarbonate. Sodium bicarbonate is a buffer that helps to neutralize the acidity coming from the digestive tract or the stomach. Remember, the stomach is acidic, but as that acid chyme moves into the small intestine, it gets neutralized by a dose of sodium bicarbonate from the pancreas. So that brings our pH back up to around 5 or 6 or so. Our next accessory organ here is the liver, and the liver is one of the largest internal organs. It sits just above your stomach, and it's right there below your rib cage. And so it does a lot of things. It secretes bile, and bile is not an enzyme, but it's an emulsifier, right? It helps to emulsify fats or break them down into smaller globules so that our lipase enzymes can continue to break them down. The liver also has an amazing storage function. All the nutrients that you absorb through your GI tract are routed directly to your liver through something called the hepatic portal vein. And basically the liver decides what to do with those molecules, whether to store them in the liver or distribute them throughout the body. And it can even interconvert some molecules into others. For example, let's say you're eating a no-fat diet, but you're eating lots of carbohydrates. Once you kind of reach your carbohydrate reserve and your liver has made all the glycogen it can make, it can then convert some of those carbohydrates into fats and vice versa. Okay, other functions here is it helps to detoxify metabolic waste like ammonia and also alcohol. So if you drink alcohol, this is the first place it's going to be going to after your stomach, right? It's going to go to your liver, and your liver is going to oxidize that alcohol as best as it can. The liver is also an important site for the destruction and recycling of red blood cells because remember, they only live about 120 days. So we do a lot of recycling of that here and also in the spleen. Okay, now we're about 2/3 of the way through the GI tract. Now we're at the large intestine. The difference between the large intestine and the small intestine is firstly diameter. The small intestine had a diameter of about 1 inch. The large intestine has a diameter of about 2.5 inches, or about that right there. So it has a large diameter, but not a very large length. So the function here is absorption, but not so much nutrient absorption. We are going to absorb some vitamins that are freed up through bacterial fermentation, because there's a lot of bacteria in here, but we're not really absorbing amino acids and carbohydrates and stuff like that. All of that primarily happens in the small intestine. So the main functions of the large intestine are absorbing excess water from the food and also absorbing any vitamins or minerals that are freed up from bacterial fermentation of what is left over. And finally, the large intestine helps us to get rid of that excess fecal material through the process of defecation. Okay, let's first take a look at the anatomy of the colon. What I'd like you to notice first is the colon has 4 different parts. We have an ascending colon, a transverse colon going across, a descending colon, and then a sigmoid or S-shaped colon. These unite eventually to form something called the rectum, which is where feces are stored prior to defecation. Now, I want to point out one thing here is that we have these functional units of the large intestine called haustrum, or haustra are plural, and these are the pouches here. And these pouches are very important for the main function of the large intestine, which is drying out the fecal material before it's defecated. The other thing I want to point out here is the external and internal anal sphincters. So we have these sphincters, and the important thing to realize is that one of the sphincters is involuntary, and the other one is skeletal muscle and is voluntary. So the only thing between you and calamity is one little ring of skeletal muscle, the external anal sphincter, that you can control to decide whether or not you want to defecate now or when your intestine wants to defecate. All right, if you remember back to the last slide, we said the 2 functions of the large intestine were to absorb excess water from the food before we defecate out the excess as feces, and also to absorb any nutrients that are freed up by bacterial fermentation. And by nutrients here, I'm referring to vitamins and minerals and things like that. So there are 2 different processes going on. The first one of these is called haustral churning. So haustral churning involves the gradual movement of food, or eventually fecal matter, from one haustra to the next. And it's going to spend time in one haustra, and as it sits there, it's going to dry out. The haustrum is absorbing excess water and placing that back in the bloodstream. After a while, that haustrum contracts. Bloop, goes to the next one. Sits there for a while, dries out, bloop, up to the next one. And this is a very gradual process. It's a process you're probably not aware of. You're walking around doing great things because it doesn't bother you at all. On the other hand, the next process is very apparent when it happens, and that's called mass peristalsis. All right, on the other hand, mass peristalsis is something you're going to be aware of because it's a very forceful, somewhat violent movement of fecal material across our transverse colon and then down our descending colon and then our sigmoid colon and down to the rectum. And it happens abruptly and very, very quickly, and it is involuntary, right? So you're sitting there in a meeting or something like that, you're drinking your coffee, you've been drinking coffee for about an hour, and all of a sudden it's like, and you're sitting there, clench your butt cheeks, and the reason is because this involuntary movement is very fast, it's very forceful, and then it forces that feces into the rectum, and in actuality, the first involuntary anal sphincter will open up, and it's only that external anal sphincter, which is made of skeletal muscle, which is preventing you from crapping your pants. So be glad for the external anal sphincter. Okay, while we're on the subject of the large intestine and defecation, we need to mention something called the gastrocolic reflex. So this is basically a signaling between the stomach and the large intestine, and it's basically the stomach saying, hey, I've got food coming in, we're eating something. If the large intestine is full, we better make some room so that we'll have room to process the new food. And so it's both an endocrine and also a nervous signal between the stomach and the intestine, and it basically tells the large intestine to hurry it up and get rid of what it's got now because more food's on the way. All right, after that happy discussion of digestion and defecation, let's talk about food. We're going to review the 3 major macromolecules that are found in the human diet, and those include carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So first, let's start out with carbohydrates. So examples of carbohydrates would be grainy foods like oatmeal, things like breads, and also simple sugars like we find in honey or even table sugar. Okay, so carbohydrates have some energy in them. They have about 4 kilocalories for a gram, and they should be the major source of energy for most of us. The USDA says that around 60% of our calories should come from carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates, again, examples are sugars, and then we have complex carbohydrates, things like whole grains, and complex carbohydrates are thought to be better for us because they are digested more slowly, and they also have beneficial fiber along with it. And the purpose of that fiber is to help basically aggravate the digestive tract to secrete mucus, and that helps to wash things along the GI tract. The other thing that fiber does is it actually grabs a hold of cholesterol from the GI tract that would normally be recycled. So it can actually help to lower your cholesterol levels if you eat a diet that's high in fiber. All right, now let's talk about proteins. So you already know that proteins are found in abundance in foods like meat, right? Meat, good. Meat have protein. And meat has 4 kilocalories per gram, the same as carbohydrates. But the USDA says it should be a minor source of calories. We should get less than 15% of our calories from proteins, and there's a reason for that. We do need proteins in the diet because they are a source of amino acids. And we need amino acids in order to make and repair our own tissues, which are largely made of protein. Now, there's 2 different types of proteins in foods. We say some foods are complete proteins because they have all the essential amino acids, and others are incomplete proteins because they lack some of the essential amino acids. Now, there's 20 amino acids. As it turns out, we can make about 10 or 11 of them, but there's 9 that the body cannot make on its own. It has to get from the diet. Examples are down here, like leucine, isoleucine, and so we have to get these in our diet. And meat and things like eggs are great because they are complete proteins. They contain all the essential amino acids, and so we don't have to go elsewhere and pick and choose. On the other hand, a lot of plant proteins are incomplete proteins. That is, they do not contain all of the 9 or 10 essential amino acids. So for example, if you're just eating rice, rice does not have all the essential amino acids in it. You would need to eat beans or something else with that to get all the essential amino acids in your diet. On the other hand, things like quinoa and soy and some of the more exotic grains do have complete proteins in it. So if you are a vegetarian, you don't necessarily just have to eat beans and rice all the time. Okay, now we're going to start with lipids. And lipids, we said before, are the fats and oils. Now the difference here is that lipids have 9 kilocalories per gram. They store a lot more energy than carbohydrates or proteins. And so they're very good at storing energy, but it also means that if we eat foods that are high in lipids, they also are calorie dense. And if they're calorie dense, they can be leading to obesity if you eat a lot of it. So accordingly, the USDA says that lipids and fats should be a minor energy source for humans, with no more than 30% of our calories coming from fats. So that's a guideline I want you to remember because we're going to come back to it later. Now, we said before that there's saturated and unsaturated fats. And saturated fats are the ones that have just single carbon-hydrogen bonds, and so they're solid at room temperature. Things like cheese, butter, fat that's on animal fat, all of those are saturated fats. And even though they're super tasty, we don't want to eat too much of them because that can lead to heart disease. On the other hand, saturated fats are things like oils, right? Vegetable oil, olive oil. These have carbon-carbon double bonds, and as a result, they're liquid at room temperature, and they have a lower incidence of heart disease associated with them, but they're still high in calories, so you want to eat them in moderation. Okay, this slide just contains a recap of the caloric information we talked about in the last 3 slides. So carbohydrates and proteins both contain about 4 kilocalories per a gram of either carbohydrate or protein. On the other hand, lipids have a lot more energy. They have around 9 kilocalories per gram, so they're very calorie dense. Now we're going to use that information in order to calculate the number of calories in a food item. And that food item is the KFC Double Down Burger. Now this was sort of a monstrosity created by Kentucky Fried Chicken in reaction to the Atkins diet or the paleo diet. The Atkins diet basically said you don't want to eat a whole lot of carbohydrate, you want to get most of your calories from fats and proteins, which is kind of opposite what the USDA says. So anyways, what KFC did is they had a regular burger, but they replaced the buns of that burger with 2 big slabs of fried chicken. So it's basically a lot of fat and a lot of protein and probably not a whole lot of carbohydrate. So what I want you to be able to do is, given the number of grams of carbohydrates, fats, and also proteins, is figure out the total number of calories. So here we have the nutrition label. They would normally have the number of calories there, but I've whited out that information. So first let's take a look at the fat. We can see that there's 32 grams of fat in a KFC Double Down Burger. Now remember back to what I said before, each gram of fat has around 9 kilocalories. So we take 32 and multiply it by 9. And we get 288 calories. That is, we have 288 calories from fat. Now let's take a look at carbohydrate. we have 11 grams here of carbohydrate. How many calories are in a gram of carbohydrate? Well, if you remember, it's 4. So 11 times 4 is 44. So 11 times 4 is 44 calories from carbohydrate. Now let's look at the proteins. So remember back that proteins have the same caloric value that carbohydrates do. So if we have 53 grams of protein, we simply multiply that by 4, and we find out that we have 212 calories from protein. So now, altogether, how many calories does a KFC Double Down Burger have? Well, we just add this, plus this, plus this, and we find out that it's around 544 calories. Now, if you remember that a normal adult diet is around 2,000 to 2,200 calories, this is about 25% or more of your caloric balance for the entire day. Now, that's not so disturbing. There's other hamburgers that have a lot more calories than that. But now let's calculate the proportion of calories that come from fat. So that would simply be taking the 288 calories from fat and dividing it by the 544. And what do we get? Well, 288 divided by 544 equals around 53%. And if you remember back to what the USDA said, they said you should be getting no more than 30% of your calories from fat. But this has 53% of our calories from fat. So why is that bad? Well, diets that are high in fat, particularly saturated fat, again, have a higher incidence of heart disease and other problems. So this would not be a healthy diet choice, especially in the long term. Okay, so why do people go on the Atkins diet or the paleo diet? Well, the Atkins diet is the one we're going to talk about here, and that's a diet where we try to avoid carbohydrate and we primarily eat proteins and fats. Well, proteins have 4 kilocalories per gram, but fats have around 9, so that seems counterintuitive, right? Why would we eat something that's more calorically dense? Carbohydrates only have 4 kilocalories per gram. Well, the reason is, or at least one of the reasons, is the speed of digestion and the effects on the hunger hormones such as ghrelin. So if we look at carbohydrates, they're digested extremely quickly. So if you eat a bowl of oatmeal or something in the morning, you can break that down very, very quickly, and maybe a couple hours later, you're starting to feel hunger again. On the other hand, proteins and fats are broken down successively more slowly. And so if you eat a diet that's high in fat, even though it has a lot more calories in it, you might not feel hungry for quite a longer while, and so you might avoid eating less calories during the day because you feel satiated for a longer period of time. Okay, so as you can imagine, the USDA probably isn't that happy with the Atkins diet because it requires us to get too many of our calories from things like proteins and saturated fats. If you take a look at the USDA food pyramid, which has been around for quite a while but modified extensively, you can see that things at the bottom are things they recommend eating a lot of, and things at the top they recommend eating less of. So at the bottom here, we have our complex carbohydrates, we have plant oils and things like that. We have lots of green leafy vegetables and fruits, things that are healthy. Above that, we have nuts and legumes. And our proteins, well, they should be coming from things like poultry and fish or other lean meats. We shouldn't be getting so many of our calories up here from red meats because they're associated with too much saturated fat. We're also supposed to be avoiding things like white rice and white bread and potatoes because these foods basically contain very little fiber, and so they're not really giving us the benefit of whole grains that have a lot of soluble and insoluble fiber that help to aid in digestive processes and also eliminate cholesterol from the GI tract. Okay, you've reached the end of the lecture on the digestive system and nutrition. As always, if you have any murky points, go back and review those in the lecture. If you still have questions, send me an email or a text. Talk to you later.